But I've known my wife for longer than that. I've known her for 52 years.
52 years?
Yeah, we met when we were 8.
Wow.
We were childhood friends.
That's incredible. What would you
it's a good
say the secret to a successful marriage is?
Well, being like insanely attracted to your partner is helpful. That's helpful. What else? More practically speaking, she's honest. Like we swore when we decided to get married that we tell each other the truth. And, that's a vow that has expanding benefits as your life progresses. It's very useful to be able to trust your partner. It makes your life a lot simpler.
Yeah.
A lot simpler. Plus, you sort things out if you tell each other the truth. It means that there's conflict when it's necessary, but there's no difference between conflict when it's necessary and thinking. They're the same thing. And so people who avoid conflict avoid thinking, and that's not a good idea. You have to think when things are difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Well, of course, there's going to be conflict. You're going to have conflict around how you discipline your children, for example, because it's hard to figure out how to do it. You're going to have conflict around your finances. So you have to sort it out. And there's lots of options. And so this is one of the things people don't understand about thought. It's like, should speech be offensive? Well, only if you want to talk about things that are difficult. Why would you talk about things that are difficult then? Well, because life's difficult. You might as well sort it out instead of running headlong into a wall or off a cliff. So she's very useful. And
a lot of people avoid conflict, and I think a lot of that. That's a great point. I ask this question a lot, and that's the first time I've heard live by truth, and then you got into how people avoid conflict. So my question would be, how do you approach your wife when there is conflict?
Well, one of the things you have to understand about women is you have to listen to them. So women are more sensitive to negative emotion than men, on average. My wife is actually pretty insensitive to negative emotion for a female. But generally speaking, women are more agreeable. That would be part of the maternal dimension of their personality. And they're more sensitive to negative emotion. So they're threat detection systems. And so a woman will bring you her concerns. Now, because she's sensitive to threat, she produces a fair number of false positives, right? So she's concerned about things that maybe it's not necessary to be concerned about, but she'll be concerned about them before you are. So women initiate about 75% of divorces, for example. And you might say, well, that means women are primarily troublesome within a relationship. It's like, well, possibly. It's also possible that they pick up what's wrong in a relationship before men do on average. And because women have to care for infants, that's why they're more sensitive to threat. That's not the only reason. They're also more sexually vulnerable. They're more physically vulnerable. It makes perfect sense that they'd be more sensitive to negative emotion. And that means that in a relationship, they serve the function of threat alert. And so a woman will be concerned about something, and she'll bring her concerns to her husband, and he'll try to solve the problem right away. But that's not helpful because she doesn't know what the problem is necessarily. So she has to wander around and talk about all the things that might be a problem. And if you let her do that, she'll dispense with most of that. And then you can kind of zero in on what the problem might be. And then if you let the discussion unfold to that degree, then you can potentially offer a solution. But you can't do that too early. You learn this in therapy too. Like when people come to lay out their life to you, you might even know what they should do, but you can't tell them. First of all, they won't listen. Second, they're annoyed if you tell them because they need to figure it out. You can't steal someone's destiny from them. If you solve all your children's problems for them, well, you might think, well, they have no problems. It's like, yeah, they have a problem. They don't know how to solve their own problems. That's a big problem. And so you got to back the hell off. And it's frustrating for men often to participate in that more feminine mode of approaching the world. But if you understand that a woman who's more sensitive to trouble will detect things early, and that her discussion of those things that upsets her will clarify problems, maybe even before they arise, then you can understand that it's useful. I mean, I still have to, even after years of practicing this with Tammy, I still have to stifle my proclivity to leap to the solution. But it's, you want to solve the right problem, man. So you got to listen. And my experience as a therapist indicated to me that in the typical marriage, people need to spend at least 90 minutes a week talking to each other just about their lives, just about the domestic economy, about their kids, about their relationship, just to keep everything up to date. And it's very difficult to have any true intimacy if that isn't allowed for.
Did you say 90 minutes a day?
No, 90 minutes a week.
Is that rare?
Half marriages end in divorce, so it's rare enough. I mean, you might find that frustrating that you have to spend that much time attending to your domestic landscape, let's say, but it's better to do that on a regular basis than to do it in divorce court while you're paying your lawyers, $500 an hour and having a custody battle for your kids for 10 years, which is not a fate that I would recommend for anyone who wants to have a happy life. So it's also the case that it's very difficult to engage in any romantic adventure with your wife if there's things between you. It's very hard because that's a form of play, that romantic adventure. And play is a very fragile psychophysiological state. If there's anything between you that hasn't been sorted out, you can't play. So.
Very interesting. I did not realize that was 90 minutes a week sounds like nothing.
Hey, man, if it keeps your marriage together, it's a pretty decent investment. I would say that's a minimum.
Yeah.
But, and that would be 90 minutes a week that's specifically devoted to, like your marriage and family as a business, let's say, practical affairs. Practical affairs. May take longer than that. Depends on how much disarray there is in your life. But if you start hoping that it's going to be less than that, you drift apart too. You have to weave your stories together like a rope across your life. You have to know what your wife is up to and what she's thinking and vice versa. And you have to be on board with your interpretation of the past and the present and also your aims in the future. And that's constant negotiation. See, in our culture, we have this idiot idea that your identity is whatever you say it is. I mean, it's unbelievably immature and narcissistic. In a marriage, your identity is almost never what you say it is. You're negotiating who you are with your wife all the time, and vice versa. And with your kids, for that matter. Your identity, if you're a civilized human being, your identity is a negotiation. People think, I just got to be me. It's like, I don't want to be around you if that's what you're like. I don't mean that you should be a pushover and that there should be nothing in the situation for you, that you live like a bitter martyr only for the pleasure of other people. That's not helpful. But being mature means negotiating your identity constantly. That keeps you alert and alive too. And I spoke with a very wise man here, Tor Nortranders, just a week ago, and he said something interesting. He said that he could see all women in his wife. And I thought, how the hell do you figure that out? That's a rare thing to understand. He's a very wise person, a Danish author. And if you communicate and then you have all that in your relationship. You can let all that make itself manifest. And if you do that, don't box up your wife. What is it? Peter, pumpkin eater. Put his wife in a pumpkin shell, and there he kept her very well. What does that mean? Well, that's what people do to each other. They put each other in a box, and they don't let their partner or themselves out of that box, and then they get bored. Well, if you communicate with your partner and you facilitate their development, then they continually reveal new parts of themselves, and then your relationship stays dynamic and alive. And that's a good deal.
Do you think people realize they put their partners in a box?
You can get to a very bad place one idiot step at a time. So do you realize it? You realize what you're doing at each micro step. You may be completely ignorant of the total consequence of that. You know, like if you want to build a pathological personality, you do that one lie at a time. And you might say, well, is someone with a pathological personality conscious of their pathology? And the answer is no, it's habitual by that point. But they were conscious at each decision step.
Interesting.
Well, it's terrible. It's terrible. It's a frightening thing. This is why you shouldn't lie. So if you lie, you automate your deception, and that's what you become. And then it's built into you then. It's not just some attitude you have. You rewire yourself in accordance with the lie. It's a very bad idea. If you knew what that meant, you wouldn't do it. Really. If you could understand what the full consequence of that, you'd step very carefully in your life.
It's interesting to see people who lie, and I don't know if they actually believe their own lies eventually.
Yes, definitely.
But
you believe the story you tell yourself. If you tell yourself habitually, if the terrible thing that happened is in the past, because you don't want to do this if it's too soon. You know, you have these psychologists who rush in to schools during a shooting and have the kids talk about it. All that does is make it worse. Like, it's a traumatic event. If you dwell on it while it's happening, it makes it worse. Now, if it's something that's 5 years distant and still a hot memory, it's something that has to be confronted. Then you go and write it down in painful detail and try to assess exactly what happened and why you acted the way you acted. And that can be curative, but that's painful. It's painful in the short term. And the research on these sorts of programs shows that if you have people write about a traumatic experience, let's say, that it worsens their mood in the short term. It's not surprising. That's why they want to avoid thinking about it to begin with. But the long-term consequences are positive. So if you've encountered something traumatic, it's like there's an abyss in your life and you'd fallen into it. And the reason you're still upset about that is because you don't know why you fell into it. And so your brain, your mind, your soul is warning you. It's like, you fell into a pit, buddy, and you don't know why. And so you could fall into it again. And so I'm not going to let you forget it. You have to figure out why you fell into that pit. And if you've done something particularly terrible, then that's a very deep pit. And that's very, very hard on people. It's very common for soldiers, for example, to develop post-traumatic stress disorder when they watch themselves do something they can't believe they could do. And it flips their understanding of themselves upside down. They don't know who they are. And they also don't know who other people are. And they don't know what the world's like. It's not what they thought it was, that's for sure. And there's a lot more to them on the dark side, let's say, than they could have ever imagined. It's like, that's definitely the case. Well, how do you come to terms with that? You come to terms with that fundamentally. The deeper the trauma, the more a religious approach is necessary. Because if you're traumatized, you're in the landscape of good and evil. Right? You're traumatized by an encounter with evil. It's not mere tragedy. It's not just that something bad happened to you. Bad things happen to people all the time without them being traumatized. Usually if someone's traumatized, they've been bit by malevolence. Might be their own, might be someone else's. They've been bit by malevolence. They don't know what to do with that. They don't know what to do with the reality of evil. One of the things you do with the reality of evil is start to understand the mythological landscape, and that is the landscape of good and evil. And then you have to start to understand what good means and what the pathway back there is. You know, part of the religious enterprise, the Christian enterprise, deals with this very forthrightly. It's like people can wander very badly off the path and end up in places they can't tolerate being. How do you get back? Confess. Repent. Atone. That's exactly right. What's the confession? Well, what do you do? Everything. What do you do? Okay? Repent. Well, Could you set yourself up so you wouldn't do that again? How would you have to change yourself, the way you look at the world, so that you don't fall into that pit again? Atone. What do you have to do to make it good, to make it right? And if you don't do that, then you're stuck in hell.
Do you think there's always a way to make it right?
You could pray that was the case. They promise, like the Christian promise is that the answer to that is yes. But the depth of the confession and the difficulty of the repentance and atonement is proportional to the magnitude of the sin. So that's rough, but it makes sense, right? I mean, if you did something terrible, it's not going to be easy to fix it, but that doesn't mean you. The Christian insistence is that there's always a pathway back.
I have somebody coming on who had to, maybe didn't even have to. I told him I didn't want to have the entire conversation on the phone, and that if he wanted to have it here, then we could have it here. And he says he does, but he killed a child. Mm-hmm. And it's stuck with him for years. Mm-hmm. It's haunted him. How do you make that right? How do you make something like that right?
I would say in a situation like that, the devil's in the details, right? So if I was working with someone like that, the first thing I would find out is, well, what happened? Mm-hmm. Because you need to know the details, because, for example, in the story that you laid out, I don't know if that was, how much of that outcome could be attributed to the situation.
Well, let's just say it was a justified kill, but it still haunts him. I think it probably haunts a lot of the team members that were a part of that operation. But whether it was justified or not, he's still struggling with it.
Yeah.
He doesn't feel, I don't want to speak for the man, but it obviously bothers him because it got brought up right away. And he wants to bring that up here. And so,
well, what would I investigate then? So imagine he's torturing himself, and imagine he's doing that in a way that is counterproductive, and that's also counterproductive in relationship to his family. Is that helping or making it worse? Right? I mean, so that's something to think about. I'm speaking hypothetically because obviously I don't know this person. I don't know what their situation is, but almost everyone has other people depending on them. And if you overburden yourself with guilt and take yourself out, you're going to hurt people around you. So you have a moral obligation to not do that if you can avoid it. So that's one of the things I would investigate to begin with. I would find out, well, exactly what happened. What were the situational requirements? Conscientious people tend to overestimate their culpability in any given situation and downplay the situational factors. And that's called the fundamental attribution error. And it's particularly true for conscientious people. So I do very careful analysis of the situation and find out, well, was it likely that anyone would have done that in that situation? Okay, well then there's another problem that comes along with that, which is, well, what does it mean about life that you can be in a situation where you have to do something terrible to proceed? That's a religious question to some degree. And there are ways of addressing that. In terms of atonement, likely what I would have him do is I would ask him, to begin with at least, is like, well, imagine that you were counseling one of your friends who has this problem, and you wanted to help him calculate a pathway forward that would enable him to get on with his life. What would you require from him? What sacrifice would you require for him? Because people will often burden themselves with an impossible moral task, and it's not helpful. It's not right to take yourself out of the game, right? So I can't be much more specific than that because the devil's always in the details. It has to be personalized. One of the things that I've done with people who've had post-traumatic stress disorder is I've familiarized themselves with the literature of horror. That's very useful. So there's a book called Ordinary Men that details how a battalion of German police officers were turned into the murderers of naked pregnant women in Poland, one step at a time. There's a book called The Rape of Nanking, which is about what the Japanese did in China at the run-up to the Second World War. The woman who wrote that, Iris Chang, she committed suicide. It's a rough book. Human beings have a very dark side. And now and then, what happens to someone who's traumatized is they run into that dark side. Well, how would that be conceptualized religiously? Well, if you meet Satan at the crossroads, there's no necessity that you're going to recover from that. Like, these are realities. In fact, they're the deepest realities. That's why people break apart in a situation like that. They come across something that's so dark that they just can't function. Well, the first thing to become aware of is that's actually how the world is constituted. It's constituted as a landscape of good and evil. We're very bad at teaching people that. We portray it in our movies, always, in action-adventure stories, always a landscape of good and evil, a mythological quest, the Lord of the Rings, the Hobbit, the Marvel universe. You know, those are all landscapes of good and evil. What we don't understand is that is the landscape. Now, partly we don't understand it because we're in pumpkin shells, right? It's like, normal middle-class existence. There's not much good in it in the extreme sense. There's not much evil in it in the extreme sense. It's all middle of the road. But that's not life. And if you're in that pumpkin shell and you're naive and then you encounter life, it's like, well, good luck to you, because you are completely without resources in relationship to how to deal with that. People have an immense capacity for darkness. But it's bottomless. It's bottomless. No matter how bad you think someone can act, there's something someone did that was worse than that. Mm-hmm. And no one wants to go there. And people, even when they conceptualize themselves, when people read the history of Nazi Germany, they always think they're Schindler. They always think that they're the person who would have saved Anne Frank in the Netherlands. They never read history as a perpetrator. I wouldn't have done that. It's like, did you watch people during the pandemic? In Canada, 30% of my neighbors were thrilled that they had the opportunity to inform on the people around them. Thrilled. They would have worn those goddamn masks for the rest of their life if the payoff would have been they could feel morally superior and inform. And so, people have a very dark side. And see, once you start to understand that, it also lifts the moral burden off you to some degree. It's like, well, you aren't who you think you are. You're way worse and way better. And that's your friend, for example. He discovered that. He discovered he was way worse. It's like, yeah, that's the world. That's reality. Okay, now you know that. Now you know that. You're no longer naive. You might say that. What do you do about that? Well, that's the next question. The antidote to evil is good. And good is deeper than evil. I don't know how good your friend would have to be in order to free himself from his entanglement. Maybe he has to become a saint, so to speak. Could be. There's a lot of atonement there.
Why do you think why is it so hard for people to just admit wrong instead of justifying?
Well, so that's related to that question you had about pride. We like to be right. If I'm right and you're wrong, I don't have to change. And so that's pretty convenient for me because there's a desert part of change. Like if I have to change, I have to fall apart and then I have to put myself back together. It's very annoying to fall apart. If you're arguing with your wife and it turns out you're wrong, then you have to go figure out why you're wrong. And God only knows why you're wrong. Like maybe it's a deep wrong, maybe it's a pattern. And you have to take, maybe 10% of you has to go, something like that. And that's a kind of death. It's really hard. And so people will insist that they're right so they don't have to change. Because change involves sacrifice. Change involves death. When you learn something new, the stupid part of you has to go. And it has to die. And that's actually painful. You might have put a lot of work into that stupid part of yourself, you know, and then you have to let it go. And then it's not like like I said, it's not like you're better as soon as you let it go. It's no, you're just lost on that front. Then you have to figure out what to do instead. In the religious orientation, what you try to do is you try to replace insisting that you're right with trying to find out how to be right. And that's the opposite of pride. That's humility. It's like, okay, there's some pathway forward here that I could journey down if I could only specify what it was. It's very difficult to keep, and this is the same thing in marriage. This is why you talk for 90 minutes. It's like to keep things from aggregating. So the small things that you avoid collect in your closet, and in the closet they turn into a monster, and then one day when you're weak they come leaping out of the closet and devour you. That's an ancient story. When you were with the psychedelic experiences, you said that there was a relationship between childhood experiences and the traumatic experiences that you were describing. Was that something that you experienced in a rush? Like, how did those connections make themselves manifest?
With me, there was not really any connection. It was more chronological order, and I don't understand what the connection is, and that's why I'm asking you, is because it's a trend that I see when I talk to gents about this type of stuff. It always seems to go back to childhood.
You know, that's what Freud observed. Well, it's because everything you've encountered in your life that you don't understand is traumatic to some degree, merely because you don't understand it. It's unmapped. You haven't coped with it properly. You don't know how to deal with it. And so all of those things are tagged pretty much forever with anxiety, with entropy. Like, they are entropy itself. They're confusion itself. And you have to make the world out of that. So the great hero creators of the cosmos in the mythological world are always those who face the dragon of chaos, who cut it into pieces and make the world out of the pieces. It's the oldest story we know. It's the dragon fight in its most fundamental sense. A dragon is a monster that's composed of monstrous parts. And monstrous parts are parts that are terrifying, but that also don't, like, a monster is something that's an aggregate of a monster is an aggregate of the incomprehensible. That's a good way of thinking about it. And so everything that's happened to you that's incomprehensible is going to be part of that monster. And you have to deal with all of it? Well, you either deal with it or you don't. And if you don't deal with it, you carry it with you. That's how it goes. That's how it works. It could easily be, too, that, people who were primed, let's say, for post-traumatic stress disorder had a sequence of traumatic occurrences in their past that have already cracked them in some ways. Speech without responsibility might be fatal. And I'm saying that as an advocate of free speech, but there's a very big difference between free speech on Twitter and the free speech you and I are engaging in right now. Like, you're sitting right there. There's a lot of things that I'm not going to say to you. Like, not because I'm hiding, but like, I'm going to be polite.
There would be an immediate consequence.
There would definitely.
There is no immediate consequence on Twitter.
Well, worse. The consequence of being psychopathic might be positive on Twitter. Right. Whenever the psychopaths get the upper hand, society dies. And it could be, like, I'm afraid of this. I think it's possible that social media enables the psychopaths, fundamentally. It's very worrisome. I mean, there are a lot of bad actors on, well, you read comments, people need a slap.
Yes, they do.
They certainly do. And there's no way of administering said slap. And so one of the consequences of that, for example, many psychological commentators had made this point, Twitter devolves into female aggression. So females, when they're aggressive, they use reputation savaging, gossip, and innuendo. It's unbelievably corrosive because they can't engage in physical combat. And so that makes female antisocial behavior unbelievably pernicious and difficult to regulate. Twitter enables gossip, reputation, savaging, and innuendo, unconstrained. So what does that mean? It means everybody who tilts in that direction has free rein, but it also means that even if you don't tilt in that direction, it's going to tilt you in that direction. So we don't know. These are unbelievably powerful communication systems. You know, you can write something casual that 1 million people will read. Well, maybe you shouldn't ever write something casual that 1 million people should read. Like maybe that's a reason for it not to be casual. Maybe if we have a technology that enables people to discuss things casually with 1 million people, we just all die. Like that could be. We have no idea what we're doing with these transformations of communication. We have no idea. It's very difficult to be on Twitter without always feeling like you need to take a shower. You know, and I wouldn't say that I'm at my best on Twitter. Why do I use it? I use it because that's how I keep track of the doings of 700 people that I know. I do it so that I know what's happening in the moment, and that's often where I find my podcast guests. What's the downside? It's easy to say stupid, casual things, and you're immersed in this responsibilityless landscape of casual speech where all the psychopaths come out to play.
It's made, I mean, I don't know if this is what made it, but this is something that I want to get into with you is the polarization. People have become, I don't know if this is the right word, but almost tribal, it seems like. And, you know, what really, I'm always, every day, every single day I wake up, I'm wondering, how did we get here? Why is the country the way it is? It's not just the country, it's the entire world. Why is the world the way it is now? And you know, kind of where I'm going with this is people have put so much faith into political parties, political candidates. They refuse to look at or admit wrongdoings of anybody that they back. And that's you have the right calling the left sheep, and they're doing the same thing. They're doing the same thing. I could show them a million different things of, hey, look at, this is what this person did. And they will dismiss it, and they will make excuses for it, and they put, why has it become so polar? Nobody can, it's like we've lost all critical thinking skills in the world, it seems like to me.
Well, the new technologies flattened the information hierarchy so that everybody can communicate with everyone. Everyone's now a journalist. That might be too many journalists. You know, we've radically expanded the degree to which we're connected with people. And okay, so you can imagine if you're a good person, perhaps that's a good thing. If you're a bad person, it's a really bad thing. A lot of the people that aggregate together online, for example, they wouldn't have a single friend in the actual real world. Mm-hmm. No one would, like your typical basement dwelling, resentful keyboard warrior. It's like if he was left to his own devices without this technological intermediation, he'd have zero impact on anything because no one can stand being around him. But he's magnified madly online and can aggregate with other people. That's what I mean in some ways by the enabling of the psychopaths. So it's not that easy for psychopaths to organize because no one likes them, including other psychopaths. But Well, they can certainly organize. They can certainly organize online. And so we're enabling that. And people are not cognizant of the danger. I've talked to Democrats for 7 years, 50 congressmen, senators, people in positions of authority, RFK, Dean Phillips. I always ask them the same question. When does the left go too far? They never answer. They have no idea. They don't take the fringe seriously. They think, oh, those people don't mean it. It's like, people tend to mean what they say. I know people lie, but often the easiest way to find out what someone's up to is just to listen to what they say. They'll tell you. Hitler told everyone what he was up to. He wrote a whole book about it. Oh, no, he couldn't be up to that. It's like, yeah, pretty much he was up to that. These people who come out and say, we should burn everything to the ground and start again. It's like, that's what they mean. Oh, they don't really mean that. They don't mean that with equity. They don't mean equality of outcome. They don't really mean that. They mean it. They have sway online and far more than is good for us. Is that part of the polarization? I think so. I think the polarization is driven to some degree by the fact that social media enables the psychopaths. So we know what they're like. So we know this is true, by the way, because these people are much more likely to troll post online. So there's been psychological investigations into that. What's the psychological makeup of LOL troll posters? These are people who are doing it for the laughs, doing it for the lulls, just causing trouble. Ha, ha, ha. They're psychopathic. So that means they're predatory parasites. They're narcissistic, which means they want reputation without earning it. They're Machiavellian, which means that they use their words to do nothing but manipulate for their own short-term benefit. And to cap it all off, because that's not enough, they're sadistic, which means they take positive delight in the suffering of others. All right? That's not good. None of that's good. And so you let those people take the upper hand, you're in serious trouble. And you don't need that many of them to bring things to a shuddering halt. It was a very small minority of people who fomented the Russian Revolution. Tiny percentage of the population. You let those people out from under their rocks at your peril. And the marginalized, it's like, we should welcome the marginalized. It's like, okay, what are you going to do with the fringe of the margin? Well, they don't exist. It's like, wait till they show up at your door, buddy. You'll be thinking twice about the fact that you opened the gate when those people show up. And if the fringe of the fringe isn't enough to terrify you, the margin of the fringe, they'll do the trick. And people don't have, we talked about this earlier, they don't have imagination for that kind of evil. They don't want to look at that. Even Michael Schellenberger. I talked to Michael a couple of weeks ago about the WPATH files. Marcy, I think Bowers is his name, the surgeon who runs WPATH, the surgeon who operated on Jazz Jennings, the surgeon who's surgically converted 12,000 people. Right, an absolute bloody monster. It's like, you want to look at that? Well, Michael told me when I started talking to Helen Joyce, for example, who wrote a book on the trans phenomena, he didn't want to look at it. He couldn't believe that could be happening. And that was Michael Schellenberger. I mean, Michael, he'll look. He looked into the Twitter files. I mean, Michael's a great journalist. What's his name? Mark Cuban came out the other day on Lex Fridman's show, and he said, well, in order to believe that this sort of trans butchery is happening, I'd have to believe that the nurses and the physicians and the psychologists are all in on it. Well, that's ridiculous. It's like, have it your way. I can see why you don't want to believe that. People won't look. We've given the marginal the upper hand in the social media networks, and that could be fatal. Like, I really mean that. We have no idea. We have no idea how significant this transformation in communication is. We have no idea the long-term consequence, let's say, of Twitter. I mean, Musk took it over because he hoped he could make it into something good, on the free speech side. And I think he's improved it a lot. But it could be intrinsically evil. It's highly probable. Well, think about it this way. What's the probability that a radical revolution in connectivity would only have positive consequences? Like zero, right? Because positive consequences, they're really... If you take any complex system and you radically disturb it, the probability that the radical disturbance will be a net good is infinitesimally low compared to all the ways it could fall apart. You can't throw a wrench into a military helicopter and improve it. So, and what we've done is we've connected people. That's a major league technological transformation. You're going to be looking for times when you made real sacrifices on behalf of something higher and that was successful, when you were of service to other people, when you were good for the people that you loved, when you went out of your way to accomplish something difficult. You'll be able to satisfy your conscience with those memories. Well, what if you just lived like that? That's the Christian call. The Christian call is to bear maximal responsibility. That's what the cross means. It means to pick up your cross and walk uphill. What's the cross? Death, pain, malevolence. That's what it is. It's unjust death. That's the cross. What does it mean to bear that? Well, it means to bear the weight of life responsibly. Why do that? Because it's deeply, well, first of all, it's good. And just that in and of itself might be sufficient. But it's also, it's in keeping with that, it's deeply meaningful. I tell young men, it's like, find something difficult to do. You need that. You're not built for comfort or pleasure. Like if that comes along, good. You know, if you have a day where you're comfortable and there's some things around you that give pleasure, have some sense and enjoy it. But don't be thinking that's what your life is aimed at. That's contemptible. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows that. And if they orient themselves in that hedonistic direction, there's nothing in it but shame. No one is proud of themselves for using pornography. They might screech and bitch about their right to do it. You know, I can live whatever lifestyle I want. It's like, well, first of all, no, you can't. That doesn't work. It won't work for you because you can't sell yourself out, and it won't work for other people. We know, for example, who engages in hedonistic short-term mating strategies. We know that from the psychological literature. So imagine on the one end of the reproductive strategy distribution are people who commit to the long run. And on the other end are the people who pursue short-term hedonistic one-night stand relationships. Okay, now you can ask, who are these people? Well, the people who commit to the short-term responsibility-less sexual gratification relationship are psychopathic, narcissistic, Machiavellian, and sadistic. And if they don't start out that way, they train themselves to become that with that lifestyle. Like the Marquis de Sade, you might ask, well, who the hell cares? If I can gratify myself at your expense, why the hell shouldn't I? Who's to say that's wrong? And my answer to that would be, go try it. See what happens. Well, what'll happen? You will degenerate because you're exploiting other people and yourself. And you can't exploit other people and yourself without degenerating. You will never form a relationship because who the hell's going to hang around with you? If it's all about you and all about you in the moment, you're the last person anyone wants to be around. So that means that as you age, you'll become increasingly isolated. There's nothing more despicable than a 50-year-old hedonist, oldest guy at the frat party. Oh, that's a hell of a name. You know perfectly well. Maybe if you're 30 at a frat party, even then, like the eyebrows are up. If you're 40, not only are their eyebrows up, you're kind of a creep. Mm-hmm. Or maybe you're really a creep, like a serious creep. And creep can get pretty damn serious. So those lifestyles, they don't work. They don't work for the person because they're not sustainable, not within the context of the relationships that would make for a community. And they don't work communally, obviously, because community is based on sacrifice. That's why civilized societies are monogamous. Well, why? Well, because if you dispense with monogamy, What happens if you dispense with monogamy? Well, we already know. Here's what's happening on the college campuses. So imagine now you have a college campus that's 65% female and 35% male. So you think, well, that's pretty good for the men because they're making out like bandits. It's like, no, a tiny fraction of the men are making out like bandits. Like, maybe 10% of them, let's say. It's probably more like 5%. High status, high value males. And they sort of have the pick of the women. And the women are all after those guys. They don't care about the other guys. They're after those guys. And those guys have like 10 women. So what are they learning? Well, they're learning how to exploit 10 women. So they're just turning into exploiters. What happens with the women? Well, they don't have a relationship. They're all chasing the same high status guy. And he has options. So he doesn't have to make any sacrifices to formulate a long-term relationship. So the women any of the decent women they're just, what the hell's left for them? They can sell themselves out, to be an easy lay for the high status guy. But that women pay a massive price for that. Women pay way more a price for sexual immorality than men do because the cost for them is obviously much greater. The risk is much higher. So the shame is greater in consequence. I don't think it's any better for a man to do that than for a woman. That's not my point. But a promiscuous woman is selling herself out immediately and in the long run in a way that's more profound than a promiscuous man. They're equally morally reprehensible in some ways. Maybe.
Would you say just about any man who was put in the top 5%,
yeah,
would they act the same?
Well, that's complicated, isn't it? There's a reason Andrew Tate's popular. Andrew Tate's popular because it's better to be Andrew Tate than to be an incel. Right, and so it's not surprising that a man who has zero sexual value would admire someone who has his pick and choice of hoes. Because that's actually an improvement. Right? It's the improvement. Someone who's peaceful because they're a coward isn't an improvement over a gang member who will fight. He's worse. He's just pathetic. His goodness is all weakness. The gang member at least will fight. Now, is the gang member good? Well, he's good compared to the coward. Is he good compared to what's good? No. And Andrew Tate's the same way in some ways, or the people who, let's say, the pathway that Tate represents. He had enough courage to go out there and get for himself. At least he isn't hiding in his basement. And he's a fighter. And so you can see why people admire that too, because he actually does put himself on the line. But he worked as an electronic pimp. Well, if you have no women working as an electronic pimp, that looks like a pretty damn good deal. But it's not the right deal. The right deal is to be attractive to women. Radically attractive to women. Radically attractive enough to women so that you have your pick of women. And then to find one woman. And society falls apart if that doesn't happen. That's a sacrifice, obviously. I mean, it's a funny sacrifice because what you get from the sacrifice is your life. I've been married for 35 years. Okay, so what's the advantage to that? Well, I've been through a lot with my wife. She understands me. She understands in a deep way. She's been with me for decades, 5 decades. She knows me in a way that no one else could possibly know me. We were kids together. We've gone through all these transformations together. We've had kids together. We've gone through a lot of adventures and trials. We know each other deeply. There's huge significance in that. There's huge reality in that and challenge to keep it working and dynamic. Otherwise, your life fragments.
I mean, it's an interesting conversation because everybody. I think that everybody has the temptation to. It's in all beings.
Well, if you don't have the temptation, then you're lying or you're weak.
Yeah, it's in all beings that the male wants to plant his seed in as many females as possible.
Yeah, well, that's a proclivity.
And so it's I 100% agree with what you're saying, but it's just, it's.
Well, that's the female romantic fantasy, the female myth is Beauty and the Beast. Tameable beast. In the Disney movie Beauty and the Beast, the woman, who's quite a stellar character, right? She's beautiful and she's wise and she's intelligent. She has her choice. She's got narcissist, like she's got loser, the village men. She's got narcissist, that's Gaston, and she's got beast. Now you might think, and the stupid women like the narcissist. They don't like the losers. They don't like the dwarfs. They like the narcissist. Now, stupid women like narcissists. Naive women like narcissists because they confuse their narcissism with competence and confidence. And that's how narcissists exploit. They look like they're confident. They look like they're competent. Beauty, Gaston is after her, wants to charm her. She goes for the beast. Well, the beast is a monster. He's a traumatized monster even. But she hopes that he's tameable, that she can bring him into relationship. And like a good beast has options, but he'll forego the options for the relationship. That's the female sexual fantasy. So, tameable beast. Now, that's rough, right? Because how likely is it that you're going to be able to tame a beast? Not that likely, but pretty damn useful if you can do it. Then you have someone who can keep the real beasts at bay, right? And it's a really, like, women have to negotiate a very tight line because they're looking for men who are disagreeable enough to be able to tell the monsters to go to hell, but who are generous and productive enough to share. That's a hard target to hit. It's a hard target for a man to become too, because you can imagine Tate would be a good example of that. He's got all the temptations of success. Well, why not fall prey to them? Well, compared to not having success or the temptations, it's better to have success and the temptations. But it's actually better to have the success and then not fall prey to the temptations. Right, then that's a real mastery. High order mastery that's truly admirable.
When I graduated from that, I never felt more pride. Another reason I did it was I always felt that I had fallen short in childhood, and I wanted my parents to have something to be proud of.
Okay, so let's separate pride from accomplishment.
Okay.
Right, because you could see pride would be unwarranted pride in your accomplishment. But that doesn't mean that there's no such thing as accomplishment. Okay, so do you feel that you accomplished something real when you went through the Navy SEAL training program?
Absolutely.
Okay, why was it real?
Because why was it real? It was the hardest thing that I've done.
Right. That's right. Yeah. Was it meaningful?
Absolutely.
Was it transformative?
Yes.
And it was the hardest thing you'd ever done. Okay, well, that's the pathway. The pathway to what's most real is through the hardest things that you can do. Right. And that's the path. Obviously, that's the path of adventure. You go watch a James Bond movie, which everyone loves to do, right? A romantic adventure. Well, what's James Bond doing all the time? Impossible things. And everybody thinks, wow, that's so... Well, so what? It's not fun exactly, right? Because it's better than fun. Fun is for kids, let's say. This is that pathway of sacrificial adventure. That's way better than just fun. Even though, because it's difficult even, the pathway of maximal difficulty. Now, I don't mean you should go out and play in traffic just because it's dangerous, but this is something that has been one of the things that's been great about these continued tours is that I can see people's lights go on when I talk about this. It's like, no, you're going to put yourself together by shouldering maximal responsibility. No one's ever told me that. It's like, because you see, the conservatives say you should, and they finger wag. But that's not it's not the optimal way of presenting it. It's like, no, you don't understand, is that the meaning that will sustain you in your life will be found in the voluntary shouldering of maximal responsibility. And everyone knows that. If you go out of your way for your friends, you have better friendships. If you go out of your way for your wife, you have a better marriage. If you go out of your way for your kids, you have better kids. I don't mean in this like resentful martyrdom. I don't mean resentful martyrdom. I mean generous, sacrificial productivity. If you give yourself away, you get more back. That's for sure. In the universities, I always noticed this with professors, especially when I was a graduate student. There were two kinds of professors you could work with if you were a graduate student, which means you're kind of an apprentice scientist. There was the professor who had the odd idea and was really zero-sum about those ideas. Always suspicious of his students because maybe they're taking his ideas and not giving him credit. Not generous with publication name, for example. Always assuming that everything was in short supply and that his ideas were hyper valuable and that he couldn't trust his students because he needed to get credit for what he was doing. And then there was the other kind of supervisor. My supervisor was like this. He just gave away all his ideas. He really did what he could to foster the development of the career of his students. What happened? Well, because he gave away all his ideas, he was surrounded by enthusiastic students who were really happy about him and what he was doing. And that was rewarding. And so the part of his brain that was producing those ideas grew, because things grow if you reward them. And so then he had even more ideas. It's this inexhaustible well that is replenished by its in consequence of generosity. That's that radical giving away. That's a form of courage. And that's also part of this sacrificial pathway forward. Why does Christ call upon people to be radically generous? Because that's the best. There isn't a better strategy than that. You know that, man. You know that. If you're radically productive and generous, people flock to work with you. Uh-huh. Well, that's a good deal for you. You know, you could imagine a situation where if you're in a relationship with someone, it's 60% for them and 40% for you. Just imagine that. And you might say, well, that's not fair. It's like, well, how about you have 20 relationships like that? Because people are lining up. And so with each, you only get 40%, but you got 20 of them, or maybe 100, or maybe 1,000. Now, you know, I'm not sure those ratios are correct, but you get my point. If you're going to err on the side of generosity, how could that do anything but work to your long-term advantage? I don't mean in that selfish and manipulative way. It's the strategy of community per se. We know among archaic people, hunters, hunter-gatherer groups, if you're a good hunter, you still fail most of the time. So if you're going to be a good hunter for your family, you have to deal with the fact that some of the time, even though you're a good hunter, you're not going to produce any food. So how do you deal with that? Well, you go lead all your men on a hunt, and you take down your mammoth, let's say, and you give the best parts to everyone else, and you downplay your role in the hunt. Why? Because the next time the fifth guy in the hunting group brings down a mammoth, he's pretty goddamn happy to share with you. Right, absolutely, man. Absolutely. And you know, I'm sure you understand that perfectly well in the military context, right? The leaders that people will follow to their death aren't the tyrants. Mm-hmm. Those are the guys that get shot in the back, or no, on the front lines when they've pushed their authority a little harder than would be wise. We've got big toys. We better play the right game with them. What's the right game? Well, that's the religious question. What's the right game? The right game is certainly sacrificial. I think that's obvious just in consequence of definition. Community is a sacrificial enterprise. That's why the altar is a place of sacrifice, right? The altar is at the center of the church, and the church is at the center of the community. Well, why? Because sacrifice is at the center of the community. What do you sacrifice? Well, you sacrifice the present for the future. That's maturity. Literally, that's what maturity is. And you sacrifice the self for the community. And so the most mature sacrifice is the sacrifice of self for community and future. That's, as far as I'm concerned, that's just all you have to do is think that through, and it's instantly self-evident. You know, if you have a father you admire and love, and are grateful for, all of that will be in proportion to his sacrifice on behalf of the family. Obviously, my father did everything for us. It's a hell of a thing to say about someone. It's at the core of what we admire. It's obviously at the core of community. You know, a monster who's a father sacrifices his sexual profligacy for his children. It's a hell of an offer.
Well, Jordan, time is up. I don't want you to miss your flight, so I just want to say thank you for the conversation and thank you for coming on the show. And it was truly an honor to meet you.
Thank you, sir. Feelings mutual.
Hope to do it again.
Yep.
Cheers.
You bet. Thanks a lot, man.
Yeah.